So, y'all are trying to win your fantasy this year. I think I can help with that. All right, well, welcome everybody to the first Fantasy Friday. Today, I want to share with you guys 5 tips on how you can win your fantasy. All right, so first things first, it all depends on what kind of league you have set up. So your commissioner is going to set up your league, obviously. I'm not going to give you guys a tutorial on how to play fantasy. I assume all of you already know how to play. What it is that, if you're in a cat league, if you're in a 9-cat league, standard or 8-cat league, then you want to right off the bat know which categories it is that you want to dominate, right? So in my fantasy league, I dominated the points, rebounds, and assists on most nights, okay? And I punted a couple of categories, right? And then I left one category up to gamble. So I took like an approach where if I know I have to win 5 categories against somebody on my, weekly matchup, right? As long as I dominate 5 categories for that week against that person, then, I win that head-to-head, right? So what we want to do, we want to make sure during our draft that we're picking our picks accordingly. That's number one. So make sure you choose your players wisely. We have to make sure that the players that we're picking are worth picking. They don't get injured easily. All right, I'm going to get to that with tip number 2. But the first tip is if you're in a cat league, then make sure you know which categories you're going to attack. If you're in a points league, then make sure you know that this player is going to get a lot of minutes. These are, if they're more of a three-point shooter, then you need a lot of three-point shooters on your team to be able to compete with the teams that are attacking other categories, right? So make sure you're picking accordingly, right? And that would be one of the biggest tips for sure. All in all, what you want to do, once again, you have categories that you want to dominate. So let's say, for example, you want to dominate points, you want to dominate assists, you want to dominate rebounds, right? You want to dominate those 3 categories, then look for people who are, if you get people who are getting triple doubles, like last year I had Nikola Jokic, I had Russell Westbrook, you know what I mean? Jimmy Butler was getting his triple doubles from time to time, like triple double like numbers. If you have a Giannis, whatever it is, then you can actually attack all 3 stats with one, player. And that really helps you get that boost, right? A really good approach is the 3-center approach. So, in most standard, cat leagues, right, you're going to have, you can play 3 centers, right? So that will enable you to be able to dominate the boards and dominate the blocks, dominate those big man stats. So you can have that advantage already. And then you can shape the rest of your team in accordance with the other categories that you want to dominate. So maybe you can even take 4 or 5 categories a night and then leave 2 up to gamble instead of just taking 4 categories and then leaving 1 up to gamble, right? So that's another approach that you can take, right? It all depends on your league. It all depends on how you think, how you want to structure your team, and who's available, and what draft stock position you get. That matters a lot as well, right? Like this year, I picked 8th overall for my first pick for my first league. I'm in 2 leagues this year. I wasn't a very happy camper. I ended up picking Joel Embiid 8th overall in my draft, because that was basically, I like to pick a center first. And the reason I like to pick a center first is because a dominating center like that is a rarer commodity than guards in the league and even wing players. So you want to make sure, that's another tip, make sure you're picking your centers early in your draft. I would recommend highly that you go with a center first. You can do guards first. It really depends on who's available, how, you got to be able to skim through those players during that time. Do some mock drafts. That really does help. I've done a couple of mock drafts before, but that's because I recently, just last year, went on to fantasy. I've always been a numbers guy. I knew what fantasy was. I just never really played it until last year. And I actually won my first year playing against some experienced players. So that really felt good. And that's why I'm confident to be able to give you guys tips on how you can approach your fantasy leagues and dominate in the same fashion. All right? So let's move on to tip number 2. So make sure that you're picking players that are not injury prone. The last thing you want, right, is picking a player that's, going to get injured often. Like, let's say you have CP3, who's a beast in fantasy. He's going to get you multiple categories. He's going to get you great numbers in multiple categories when he does play, right? If you have CP3 on a daily fantasy or league structure, then CP3 or Joel Embiid, for example, who gets load managed a lot, you can replace those injured players with other players on your team. So that's okay, right? But if you're on a weekly lineup set kind of league, it's going to be tough for you to be able to manage that, all right? Joel Embiid or Chris Paul, those kind of players that are often injury prone or getting load managed like that, it's going to hurt you in the long run if you're just doing set weekly lineups. So try to avoid players that get injured a lot. Sometimes you can get unlucky. Sometimes it's a fortune thing. You have a player that barely ever gets injured. It can happen. So be careful with those players that get injured. Pick durable players, pick younger players. Doesn't necessarily mean every younger player is going to be durable, but you know what I'm trying to say. Pick the healthiest horses. So tip number 3, do your research and find your sleepers. Find your sleepers. Now, I am going to make segments on sleepers. I'm going to tell you guys, I have an eye for those. Guys, I'll give you one piece of advice. Get used to, if you're not already, get used to skimming game logs very quickly. Because if you can look at the last few games, then you can really start to recognize patterns, right? Then you can get a good feel on who's hot that week, who's going to be hot, who gets hot when, and whatnot. You can look at game logs from God knows when. Now with our internet and all the statistics that are available, then you're good to go. So make sure that you are picking the players that are, first of all, least injury prone, and find your sleepers. And another thing is, a good way to find sleepers is just keep your eye on that waiver wire, right? Always keep your eye on the waiver wire. The last 2 mans on your team, the last three mans on your team, depending on how your draft went, and sometimes even the last 4 mans on your team or 5 mans on your team. Have your eye on the waiver wire. It's common sense, but you'd be surprised. A lot of people find this out later, or just don't really take the time to look. Where there can be gold, right? So you look in the waiver wire, you see that there's a player that's been hot, or a player that got dropped recently for whatever reason, whatever it is, something happened. The player came back earlier from injury. They got dropped the other week, and now they're killing it. Pick that player up. Get yourself assimilated with the idea of looking in the waiver wire on a daily basis, right? It takes a couple minutes, just see what's trending, what's good. And another tip also is look at players when you're analyzing what players you want to take. Look at their roster percentage. That'll show you how many people who play Yahoo Fantasy Basketball have rostered this player. It'll be in percentages. So 72% of teams on leagues have rostered X player. Then most likely there's a reason for that. You want to investigate and deep dive into that reason. Now, tip number 4, watch out for how many ads and drops you're doing per week. To be honest with you, my first week doing fantasy basketball, I got so panicked that I did my first 5 drops so quickly that I started the whole. I won that year, by the way, but I started it 2-8, like the Raptors last year. It's a funny number. I started 2-8. It was not a good start at all, and the last thing anybody would have thought was that I'm gonna make it. I was last place. I like 9th place or something like that out of 10 guys. And these guys were experienced players. And I made it to 4th or 5th place, and then I won from there, or 5th place, I think. So it was because later I started taking more care of how many people or how many players I'm actually dropping, how many players I'm adding, and if I'm adding and dropping any players. Remember, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So make sure when you're adding and dropping players, you're not going crazy, especially early. Really just, take a step back. Relax. It's a long season. It's a marathon, not a race. All right. And you want to make sure that you're, looking ahead instead of just trying to, shake things up on a whim. Try to really analyze the moves that you're making. Because sometimes you can drop a player and then regret it later, and vice versa. Right. So let's make sure we keep our moves limited. Okay. And very strategic. Be calculated with your moves and your decision making. All right, that'll give you an upper hand, on the knowledge and the wisdom of the full depth of the makeup of your roster. And finally, tip number 5. Okay, so if you guys have a player, that player performs really well. That player hasn't been performing too well in the last 5 games. in the last 6 games, in the last 7 games. It doesn't necessarily mean you hit the panic button right away. If a player has not been playing well for 5 games, if it's fantasy football, that's a whole different story. Seasons are way shorter. It's an 82-game season. You know, there's no need to press the panic button when you see that a player that you know you picked up for a reason, you know, in the 4th, 5th round of the draft, or 5th, 6th round of the draft, 7th round of the draft, and you just see you got off to a slow start or whatever it might be. Don't just hit the panic button right away. Be calculated with your decisions. And if you see that over a long stretch, for whatever reason, if it's age, if it's injury, if it's fatigue, if it's whatever, you want to make sure that you're aware of what the reason is this player is not performing that well, and if this is going to be a continuous thing and how it's going to affect you. So you want to really look at all angles before you make any moves like that and then regret them in the future. Because the last thing you want is to see your another team in your league pick up that same, you know, mistake and make gold out of it. You know, pick up your garbage and make gold out of it, or what you thought was garbage. Find that the garbage had gold under it. So basically, that's what it is, guys. All right, those are the 5 tips I'm giving y'all. I know it's a shorter video, but I will be coming up with more in-depth content on sleeper picks, who I think is going to perform well, what categories I think they're going to perform well in, and who I think will be on upwards trajectories and downwards trajectories, who to stay away from and who not to stay away from, all that sort of jazz. And with that being said, have a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.